So, today we're going to talk about Arthur Schopenhauer and his philosophy. I just been talking to a friend of mine, and I'm actually incredibly grateful for that conversation. It showed me a multitude of things, and it once again underlines the importance of talking to other people and also writing, at least at my point of view, because if we write things down, or when we write things down, we relatively often come to the conclusion that, wow, okay, whatever the fuck I'm thinking is actually complete bullshit. But yeah, besides that, he apparently is pretty pessimistic, which is something that I'm not. I really am not, and I also kind of take a bit of pride in being so. But we're gonna see. We're gonna see what his philosophy is about exactly, or is exactly about. Anyway, philosophy, the world as representation, which is, by the way, the Wikipedia article on Schopenhauer. There's also a Stanford article, but this one seems to be a bit more easy to read. Schopenhauer saw his philosophy as a continuation of Kant's and used the results of Kantian epistemological investigation, transcendental idealism, as starting point for his own. Kant had argued the empirical world is merely a complex of appearances, whose existence and connection occur only in our mental representation. Schopenhauer reiterates this in the first sentence of his main work, The World is My Representation, or Die Welt ist meine Vorstellung. In German, everything there is for cognition. The entire world exists simply as an object in relation to a subject, a representation to a subject. Everything that belongs to the world is, therefore, subject-dependent. In Book 1 of The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer considers the world from this angle, insofar as it is representation, i.e., insofar as it is representation. Theory of perception. In November 1813, Goethe invited Schopenhauer to help him on his theory of colors. Although Schopenhauer considered color theory a minor matter, he accepted the invitation out of admiration for Goethe. Nevertheless, these investigations led him to his most important discovery in epistemology, finding a demonstration for the a priori nature of causality. Kant openly admitted that it was Hume's skeptical assault on causality that motivated the critical investigations in Critique of Pure Reason, and gave an elaborate proof to show that causality is a priori period. After G.E. Schulze had made it plausible that Kant had not disproven human skepticism, it was up to those loyal to Kant's project to prove this important matter. The difference between the approach of Kant and Schopenhauer was this. Kant simply declared that the empirical content of perception is given to us, quote unquote, from outside, an expression with which Schopenhauer often expressed his dissatisfaction. He, on the other hand, was occupied with how do we get this empirical content of perception? How is it possible to comprehend subjective sensations limited to my skin as the objective perception of things that lie outside of me? And there's a quote, "The sensation in the hand of a man born blind on feeling an object of cubic shape are quite uniform and the same on all sides and in every direction. The edges, it is true, pressed upon a smaller portion of his hand, still nothing at all like a cube is contained in these sensations." His understanding, however, draws the immediate and intuitive conclusion from the resistance felt that this resistance must have a cause which then presents itself through that conclusion as a hard body, and through the movements of his arms in feeling the object, while the hand's sensations remain unaltered, he constructs the cubic shape in space. If the representation of a cause and of space, together with their laws, had not already existed within him, the image of a cube could never have proceeded from those successive sensations in his hand. Which, by the way, I also thought about. Like, how do you know that this is a cube? Especially also, or cubical object. I actually like cubic shape more than, it's kind of the same. I mean, it is just a word, and we could exchange words. I mean, this could be a table, this could be a pencil, this could be a chair. I don't know, like, which by the way is also a funny thing, like, the words that we're using for things, and the fact that we still know what the other person is talking about. Like, I could refer, I mean, this is a smartphone. But the question is, if you're blind and if you're feeling a smartphone, how do you know that it is a smartphone? Because you don't see it, you don't know what a smartphone basically is. I mean, you kind of create it yourself. If somebody gives something to you, and you feel certain things, maybe the glass, maybe the display, which has a certain sensation. But, well, quite interesting. Casualty is therefore not an empirical concept drawn from objective perceptions, but objective perception presupposes knowledge of casualty. Hereby, Hume's skepticism is disproven. By this intellectual operation, comprehending every effect in our sensory organs as having an external cause, the external world arises. With vision, finally the cause is essentially simplified due to light acting in straight lines. We are seldom conscious of the process that interprets the double sensation in both eyes as coming from one object. That inverts the impression on the retinas, and that uses the change in the apparent position of an object relative to more distant objects provided by binocular vision to perceive depth and distance. Yeah, with one eye covered, our perception of especially depth and space is quite distracted and inhibited, if this makes sense, restricted. This is what I meant. Schopenhauer stresses the importance of the intellectual nature of perception. The senses furnish the raw material by which the intellect produces the world as representation. So he set out this theory of perception for the first time in On Vision and Colors, and in the subsequent editions of Fourfold Root, an extensive exposition is given in paragraph 21. The World as Will. Main article, The World as Will and Representation. In Book 2 of The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer considers what the world is beyond the aspect of it that appears to us, i.e., the aspect of the world beyond representation, the world considered in itself, its inner essence. The very being in itself of all things, Schopenhauer argues, is will, der Wille. The empirical world that appears to us as a representation has plurality and is ordered in a spatio-temporal framework. The world as thing in itself must exist outside the subjective forms of space and time, though the world manifests itself to our experience as a multiplicity of objects, the objectivation of the will. Each element of this multiplicity has the same. I definitely have to read more philosophical things, and today I'm gonna start reading a book on philosophy. I don't know which one it is gonna be. I've got a recommendation by a buddy of mine, which sounds very interesting and seems to be very interesting, and we're gonna see, and maybe I'm able to find a field in which I can study philosophy without studying philosophy per se, because I don't necessarily believe that this is something that is going to contribute a lot to my life. Maybe something in terms of communication. But yeah, anyway, I don't know where I've stopped, so I'm gonna start somewhere. Though the world manifests itself to our experience as a multiplicity, it's actually a multiplicity of objects, the objectivation of the will. Each element of this multiplicity has the same blind striving essence towards existence and life. Human rationality is merely a secondary phenomenon that does not distinguish humanity from the rest of nature at the fundamental, essential level. The advanced cognitive abilities of humans, Schopenhauer argues, serve the ends of willing an illogical, directionless, ceaseless striving that condemns the human individual to a life of suffering unredeemed by any final purpose. As we are thinking about, or as I've been talking about pessimism. Schopenhauer's philosophy of the will as the essential reality behind the world as representation is often called metaphysical voluntarism. For Schopenhauer, understanding the world as will leads to ethical concerns. See the ethics section below for further detail, which he explores in the 4th book of The World as Will and Representation, and again in his 2 prize essays on ethics, on the freedom of the will and on the basis of morality. No individual human actions are free, Schopenhauer argues, because they are events in the world of appearance and thus are subjective to the principle of sufficient reason. A person's actions are a necessary consequence of motives and the given character of the individual human. Necessity extends to the actions of human beings just as it does to every other appearance, and thus we cannot speak of freedom of individual willing. Albert Einstein quoted the Schopenhauerian idea that a man can do as he will, but not will as he will. So a man can do as he will, but not will as he will. Yet the will as thing in itself is free, as it exists beyond the realm of representation and thus is not constrained by any of the forms of necessity that are part of the principle of sufficient reason. According to Schopenhauer, salvation from our miserable existence can come through the will's being tranquilized by the metaphysical insight that reveals individuality to be merely an illusion. The saint or great soul intuitively recognizes the whole, comprehends its essence, and finds that it is constantly passing away, caught up in vain strivings, inner conflict, and perpetual suffering. Which, by the way, was a quote now. The negation, of the will, in other words, stems from the insight that the world in itself, free from the forms of space and time, is one. Ascetic practices, Schopenhauer remarks, are used to aid the will's self-abolition, which, quote-unquote, by the way, which brings about a blissful redemptive will-less state of emptiness that is free from striving or suffering. Art and aesthetics, which my buddy also said, and mathematics, ethics, eternal justice, art and aesthetics, or aesthetics being kind of the only thing that can make human beings feel good somehow, besides people. Well, anyway, for Schopenhauer, human willing, quote-unquote, desiring, craving, etc., is at the root of suffering. A temporary way to escape this pain is through aesthetic or aesthetic contemplation. Here one moves away from ordinary cognizance of individual things to cognizance of eternal Platonic ideas. In other words, cognizance that is free from the service of will. In aesthetic contemplation, one no longer perceives an object of perception as something from which one is separated. Rather, it is as if the object alone existed without anyone perceiving it, and one can thus no longer separate the perceiver from the perception, but the two have become one. Yeah, if there is nobody that looks at something, then there's also actually quite some, the thing is not there that is being looked at from the perspective of the person that is looking. Quite, actually. I mean, I do have a ball there, but if I just turn away from the ball, now it could also be gone. Quite. But now it's there, if this makes sense. I don't even know if it is meant like in that way, but this is what came to my mind. So subject and object are no longer distinguishable. Oh, I've skipped a few lines, I guess. Yes, I definitely have. So one no longer perceives an object of perception as something from which one is separated. Rather, it is as if the object alone existed without anyone perceiving it, and one can thus no longer separate the perceiver from the perception, but the two have become one, the eternity of consciousness entirely filled and occupied by a single perceptual image. Subject and object are no longer distinguishable, and the idea comes to the force. From this aesthetic immersion, one is no longer an individual who suffers as a result of servitude to one's individual will, but rather becomes a pure, will-less, painless, timeless subject of cognition. The pure, will-less subject of cognition is cognizant only of ideas, not individual things. This is a kind of cognition that is unconcerned with relations between objects according to the principle of sufficient reason. Time, space, cause and effect, and instead involves complete absorption in the object. Art is the practical consequence of this brief aesthetic contemplation, as it attempts to depict the essence/pure ideas of the world. Music for Schopenhauer was the purest form of art because it was the one that depicted the will itself without it appearing as subject to the principle of sufficient reason, therefore as an individual object. According to Daniel Albright, Schopenhauer thought that music was the only art that did not merely copy ideas, but actually embodied the will itself. He deemed music a timeless universal language comprehended everywhere that can imbue global enthusiasm if in possession of a significant melody. And with that being said, I'm willing to end the episode. I hope that you have liked it and gotten something out of it. And I'm hopefully going to see you next time. So, bye-bye.